Here's a number that stops most people cold. In 2025, Social Security paid out more than $1 trillion to retirees, and it collected less than that in taxes. The program ran a deficit of about $200 billion in a single year, and it's been doing that since 2021. Now, Social Security isn't broke, not even close, but it's spending down a savings account that took decades to build. And the math on that account has a deadline attached to it. So why does this thing exist in the first place? Rewind to the early 1930s. The Great Depression had wiped out savings, closed banks, and thrown millions out of work. And for older Americans, there was almost no safety net. If you were too old to work and your family couldn't take you in, your options were grim: a county poorhouse, charity, or nothing. Growing old was one of the fastest routes to poverty in the country. In 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act. The idea was simple and kind of radical for its time. Workers would pay a small tax while they were employed. In return, they'd get a monthly check once they were too old to keep working. It wasn't charity, it was insurance. You paid in, you were covered. That's why the program's official name is Old Age and Survivors Insurance. The first monthly check went out in 1940 to a woman named Ida Mae Fuller. She'd paid in about $25 in taxes. Her first check was $22 and change, and she lived to 100, collecting for years. That gap between what people pay in and what they get out is baked into the whole design. Social Security was never meant to be a personal account with your name on it. It was built so that today's workers pay for today's retirees. Hold on to that idea. It explains almost everything about how the money moves. So what does it cost? And what does it pay? Let's start with your paycheck. The money comes from a payroll tax called FICA. For Social Security, that's 6.2% taken out of your wages. Your employer pays another 6.2% on top. So the real number is 12.4% of your earnings going into the system, even though you only see half of it on your pay stub. If you're self-employed, you pay the whole 12.4% yourself. But there's a ceiling. In 2026, Social Security tax only applies to the first $184,500 you earn. That's called the taxable maximum, or the wage base. Earn $1 above it, and that dollar isn't taxed for Social Security at all. Someone making the cap pays a maximum of about $11,400 into the program for the year. Now, what does it pay back? As of 2026, the average retired worker gets around $2,070 a month. But that's an average pulled up by high earners. Plenty of people collect less. Over a full year, that works out to roughly $25,000. Not a fortune. And that's the point. Social Security was designed to replace only part of your income. For a middle earner, somewhere around 40% of what they made before retiring. It's a floor, not a full paycheck. And when you start collecting matters as much as how much you earned. Full retirement age is now 67 for anyone born in 1960 or later. Claim early at 62 and your monthly check is permanently smaller. Wait past your full age up to 70 and it grows. Same worker, same work history. A very different check depending on one decision about timing. There's one more piece that makes this benefit unusual. Every year, it's adjusted for inflation through something called the COLA, the cost of living adjustment. For 2026, that raise was 2.8%. So unlike cash under a mattress, a Social Security check is supposed to keep pace with rising prices. Whether it actually keeps up is a fight we'll get to. Here's where it gets interesting. Social Security is what's called pay-as-you-go. The taxes coming out of your paycheck this week don't go into a personal account with your name on it. They go straight back out to the roughly 70 million people collecting benefits right now. You're paying for today's retirees, and when you retire, the workers of that day pay for you. Roughly 185 million workers pay in during a given year. That's a lot of paychecks feeding one pool. That system runs on one crucial number: how many workers there are for every retiree. In 1960, there were more than 5 workers paying in for each person collecting. Today, it's under 3. Fewer kids, longer lives, and a wave of baby boomers all retiring at once. The math has been quietly tightening for decades. Now, what about that famous trust fund? For years, Social Security took in more than it paid out. The surplus didn't sit in a vault. By law, it was invested in special treasury bonds. Basically, the program lent the money to the federal government and holds an IOU that earns interest. At the end of 2025, the main retirement trust fund held about $2.3 trillion in these bonds. You'll sometimes hear people call that trust fund a myth, just a drawer full of I O us. But those bonds are real legal obligations of the U.S. government, the same kind it sells to banks and foreign countries. The catch is that to cash them in, the government has to come up with the money from taxes or from borrowing somewhere else. But remember that deficit from the top of the video? Since 2021, Social Security has been paying out more than it collects, so it's cashing in those bonds to cover the gap. The account is shrinking. In 2025 alone, the retirement fund's costs beat its income by about $200 billion. The program's own trustees, who report to Congress every year, project that the retirement trust fund runs dry near the end of 2032. And I want to be precise here because this part gets twisted constantly. Depleted doesn't mean zero. Even with an empty trust fund, payroll taxes keep flowing in. Those taxes alone would cover an estimated 78% of scheduled benefits. It's a projection, not a prophecy, but it's the number driving every debate about the program's future. So who actually pays for all this? On paper, the cost is split, half from you, half from your employer. But ask most economists, and they'll tell you the employer's half comes out of your wages too, in the form of pay you never got. So really, workers carry the load, and they carry it unevenly. Because of that wage cap, someone earning $50,000 pays Social Security tax on every dollar they make. Someone earning $500,000 stops paying after the first $184,500. As a share of income, the janitor pays a bigger slice than the executive. That's a design choice, and it's a big reason the program's funding is always up for debate. There's also a quieter way people pay: retirees themselves. If your income in retirement is above certain levels, part of your benefit gets taxed. Those thresholds start at $25,000 for a single person. And here's the catch: those numbers were set in the 1980s and never adjusted for inflation. So every year, as incomes drift up, more retirees find a chunk of their benefit taxed, people who were never meant to be hit by it when the rule was written. Then there are the beneficiaries, who this is really for. It's not just retirees. Social Security also pays survivors like widows, widowers, and children who lost a parent, plus workers with disabilities through a separate fund. For a huge share of older Americans, this check isn't extra money. It's the foundation their whole budget sits on. For a large share of retirees, it's more than half of everything they live on. For many, it's nearly all of it. Now, the costs that don't make the headlines. Start with that raise everyone waits for each year, the COLA. It's tied to an inflation measure called CPIW, which tracks the spending of working people, not retirees. But older folks spend differently. They spend more on healthcare, which tends to rise faster than everything else. So the raise often lags the actual bills a retiree faces. On paper, the check grows. In the checkout line, it can quietly shrink. Then there's a deduction most people forget. For retirees on Medicare, the federal health program for people 65 and older, the Part B premium usually comes straight out of the Social Security check before it ever lands. In 2026, that premium is about $203 a month, so a piece of every raise gets eaten before you see it. And then there's the big one, the projected shortfall around 2032. If Congress does nothing, current law doesn't let the program borrow to cover the gap. It could only pay what comes in. That's the roughly 78% figure. For someone getting $2,000 a month, an across-the-board cut like that would be real money all at once. Now, Congress has fixed this before in 1983, right up against a similar deadline, so a cut isn't a certainty. But the longer lawmakers wait, the more expensive and painful every option gets. So step back. Why is the system built this way? Pay-as-you-go was a choice. It let the program start paying benefits right away in the 1940s without waiting decades for savings to build. That was the whole appeal. The trade-off is that it leans entirely on the ratio of workers to retirees, and that ratio is now working against it. This isn't a scandal or a fraud, it's demographics meeting a design from a different era. By around 2030, the entire baby boom generation will have reached retirement age, and the worker-to-retiree ratio is projected to keep sliding for years after that. The pressure builds before it eases. The logic also shows who carries the risk. Retirees get a promise that's remarkably safe, inflation-adjusted, backed by the government, and impossible to outlive. Workers carry the uncertainty because their taxes and their future benefits are what move when the math gets tight. The fixes are no mystery either. You can raise the payroll tax, lift or remove that wage cap, raise the retirement age, trim benefits, or some blend of all four. Every option means someone pays more or gets less. Other wealthy countries run similar public pensions and face the same aging math. They've mostly patched their systems the same handful of ways. There's no magic lever, just a bill and a question of who covers it. So what's the verdict? For all its strain, Social Security does something almost nothing else in American life does. It pays nearly every worker a check they can't outlive, that keeps pace with inflation, and that shows up whether the stock market soared or crashed the year they retired. It's not an investment. It's insurance against ending up old and broke. And by that measure, it works. Where the economics buckle is the arithmetic underneath it. A program built when workers vastly outnumbered retirees now runs in the opposite world, and it's spending its savings to bridge the gap. The winners are the tens of millions who get a stable floor under old age. The ones who'll pay the difference are future workers and future retirees. Whoever's standing there when Congress finally settles the bill, because in the end, Social Security isn't running out of money. It's running out of the ratio it was built on. And someone eventually has to make that math balance again. If this made the system a little clearer, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. There's a lot more to untangle about the money behind growing old in America.